Hello YouTube. Not too long ago, in a galaxy near you, I made a video about FM donks, and a few of you asked about the other sounds in the demo track that I used for that explanation. For those of you who haven't seen the donk video, I'm going to put that in the description. And so, with no further gilding of the lily, I'm going to get right into it. This is the project that I'm talking about. Let's start off with the kick and bass. So the kick is a kick sample that I made using Serum 2, and I've layered it with this tiny hi-hat layer. And I've made it extremely short using this compressor. That is basically dialed in using the attack time. So the attack will dictate how long it takes before the compressor clamps down. And then when it does, I've got the threshold set all the way to the bottom and a really high ratio. So it'll just completely shut off that hi-hat once the attack time is through. So if I open up this attack time, you will hear a hi-hat. But if I bring that back, I'm just bringing it back until it's literally just a tiny little tick, and then that layers on top of the kick drum. If I turn it off, so it just gives it a tiny bit more attack and a bit more brightness in that high end. And then the bass line is a sliding bass line. So the MIDI has got quarter notes, and then this last one, I've got it to be offset. So we got a slight change in groove. Also, I've got a cutoff automation. This is going to add a bit more expression to the bass line. We've got this emphasis on the offbeat on this automation, and then I've got just a little bit of a swell on that last one. And then for the second pattern, I've just got a little pitch bend using the portamento feature. And then this last note here has a nice opening up of the cutoff, so you get all of those rich harmonics from the saw wave coming through. And then I've got a nice double kick here, and I've removed the bass note. That phrase then repeats throughout the whole track, except the second time around, we don't have the double kick there. So it's just a little bit of slight variation there. And then for this particular one, I've got a quieter and shorter kick as well. And then rather than omitting the bass note in this one, we wait for that and then just remove the very last bass note. Right, the bassline patch itself is not even in a mixer track. There's no processing outside of Serum on this thing. The waveforms that I'm using are phase distorted saws. It's got all the harmonics from a saw wave, but it's just got these phases that have been altered, which gives it this more rubbery quality. And the way that you get that phase distortion is either through using frequency splitters to introduce phase shift into certain parts of the spectrum, or you could use an effect like a disperser or even the diffuser filter within Serum 2. But I'll do another video about creating your own baseline wavetables. But for now, I'm just going to move on because I've got a few other sounds to cover. What I've done is I've duplicated that wave. I've got a high pass filter on one of the warp modes because I don't want all of the low frequencies, because this is going to be a stereo layer. I'm going to use oscillator C with this shape to control the panning. So we've got a very quick audio rate left and right panning, which is going to give it a very nice wide effect. And so now if I bypass this and then turn it on, adds a bit more character to it, and it adds a nice bit of width, which helps it blend nicer with the other elements. On top of that, I've also got a little bit of FM from A, which comes in at very select moments. So you kind of get a little bit of a breaking up effect almost. So you've got a subtle textural difference there. And then for the wave itself, I've removed the very lowest frequency because I want to have independent control of the sub. We've got this first envelope, right? And the groove is going to be dictated by the shape of how quickly it fades in. With a steeper curve, you're going to end up more with a pulse. But if it's smoother, you end up with this nice glued feeling. I like to have a little bit of a pulse, so I'll have it somewhere in between. The groove also changes based on where you have this top point. I found that just after the offbeat gets quite a nice groove going. I've got this second envelope, which is attached to the sub. This comes in slightly later because I want to have that sub bass feel like it's got more of that dispersed character. But yeah, that is the essence of it. And then I've got this third one, which is controlling the cutoff. We've only got it moving a little bit with this main opening here. So we've got it just opening up for the offbeat and then closing off nicely. But then we have this EQ that is using this LFO here to remove specific frequencies out of certain parts of the bass line. So I've got a bit of this mid-range area that's cut out of the tail. And if I turn this off, you got a much warmer sound. However, if I put this back on, it kind of becomes a bit deeper and also creates more space for other elements. So it's something that I really like to do. And using the shape of this, you can dictate when those frequencies are present. So I can maybe have the mid-range stay in for a bit longer. Or I could have it come out really quickly. So we just have a much deeper sound for a lot more of the overall bass line. Nice. And then I've pretty much just got this little final LFO controlling the volume at the very end, which is just making sure that the volume is cutting right before the next kick. So we've just got a nice clean bass line that doesn't have any overlapping tails or anything like that. And yeah, we have a macro attached onto the cutoff, and that is using the automations that I showed in the beginning. Moving on, let's just talk about this snare that is a knock sound, and these are all percussives that I've created in Serum, and I've just layered them together. Let's go through the individual layers. We've got this main layer, and then another layer there, which adds a bit more character, and this third layer that is just kind of more of a noisy thing that's adding a little bit more character and fullness to the sound. And in terms of processing, we've got the first two layers that are going into this mixer track here that is just adding a little bit of frequency shifting, because I love using frequency shifters for percussion. It just makes it a little bit deeper. We've got this EQ, giving it a bit of tone shaping, wave shaper for a bit more thickness and glue, and just a bit of Valhalla room for some space. Really nice. And then we've got the noise layer that is just sitting right behind everything else. And yeah, without it, needs a bit more support. That's all that's doing, is just getting a little bit of extra juice into that sound. Next up, we've got our offbeat hat. That is just using, once again, some frequency shifting. That's going a bit higher. And then I've got this EQ that's constraining it because I only need a tiny bit. Wave shaper that is really bringing it out, because basically in your drums, especially with hi-hats, you want to make sure that one of the sounds is the dominant sound and therefore has more harmonics and more volume. And then the other sound has to be contrasting from that and therefore maybe not as saturated and not as present in the mix. So you have more of a difference between your high-end elements. Otherwise, everything can sort of become just a harsh mess. And yeah, then I've just got this transient processor. That is just tightening it up ever so slightly and giving it a little bit more attack. And then we've got these 16th shakers that are created in Serum. It's got a very similar processing chain to the offbeat hat, but it's focused just a little bit lower in the frequency spectrum. So we've got more of a push-pull between the two high-end elements. And if I head into the Serum patch, that is literally just a bit of noise going through a filter. This main LFO is controlling the volume as well as opening up the filter ever so slightly, so we get more low end at the very beginning of the shaker sound. I've got the shapes morphing ever so slightly using the note on random feature, which means that these shakers end up with quite an alive feeling as they are not very static at all. These other processes are literally just all contributing to the character of this sound. Let's start off with the chorus. Just adds a little bit more information on the stereo side of things. Got a bit of a correctional EQ there just for shaping. We've got this phaser set really high in the cutoff and it's mixed out as well. So ever so slightly changing the character there. Got this other phaser that comes in and out with the mix. It sounds much more noisy without it, and with it, it's got a lot more of these resonances that kind of make it sound more realistic. Got a bit of distortion on the end here that is just going up and down with our main envelope. And then I'm using LFO2 to control the smoothing of these LFOs here. So if I show you, the smoothing basically just rounds off the curves of any shapes that you've made. And so what's happening is this here is controlling the smoothing out of my shaker sound. Which just adds another level of dynamism and excitement to it. So now I've got these accent hats here, which are very subtle. It's easier to hear the groove of these accent hats without the shakers on. But they kind of just add a little bit of extra groove and support. They've been processed in a very similar way as the other hats, just a bit of EQ, a bit of a frequency shifter going on, making them a bit higher up, a bit of wave shaping and transient processor. That is the majority of the high end, but I've also got these like little rides which are being subtly sidechained as well to give more emphasis to the offbeat. For the second half of this drop, I've also added this tiny little reverse layer here. So every second offbeat hat has this little reverse in front of the hat. That's once again using frequency shifter, a little bit of reverb and the wave shaper. What's making this interesting is the reverb is 100% wet, which means you're not actually really hearing the reverse that much. You're just hearing the after effects of that reverse sound. So if I bring the mix all the way out for this, it's it's just quite a weird sound. If I put the mix all the way in, you're just getting that little reverb throw from it. And I basically dialed in the pre-delay and the decay time to get a certain groove out of it. If I bring the milliseconds down for the pre-delay, see how the amount of time that it takes for the reverb to kick in dictates the groove so much. And finally, in terms of drums, I've literally just got this crash, and that happens every 8 bars. So that is the drums. Moving on to the lead sounds, we've got this initial sound that is made using this saw. That is got 16 voices of unison. I've got the detune, assign shaper distortion, and the cutoff assigned to this envelope. And it's got a bunch of effects that are basically just juicing the sound up. So if I remove all of these off of here, you're going to notice it's just a saw wave, right? With some filter movement pretty much. And if I go into the mixer track, as you can see, all that we have outside of Serum is just this low cut EQ that is making sure that we don't have any low frequencies to clash with our bass. And then I've just got a little bit of reverb on here pretty much. So I've got a little EQ on here, boosting up the mid range, and then that's going into a soft saturation, giving it a nice crunch. And then we've got this multiband compressor that's just making it a lot thicker and brighter. We've got another distortion here. Once again, adding more crunch and flavor to this. And that's, as you can see, also attached to the main envelope. So it's reinforcing that same movement. I added this cleanup EQ here, also following the same movement. And that just makes it so the sound isn't as bright throughout the whole thing. And then I've got another distortion because, you know, more flavor, more warmth, more character. And then I've got this second LFO, which is literally just opening up the filter cutoff and resonance towards the end of the sound. So it's just kind of got more of a direction to it. That's pretty much that sound. That is a very simple sound. It is also routed to the sidechain, so we got a nice pulse from it. Without that, with it. Next up, we've got these pretty cool little FM sounds. They are both one patch. We've got a sine wave that is just on a little volume envelope like this. And then we've got this 8th note filter movement here. Without the filter, it's less defined. What we've got here is this warp macro, and this is what's changing the character of our FM. This first sound that has got more of this bubbly quality, and that's because we've got this ramp up, which if you've watched my video on FM, you'll know creates these kinds of nice bubbles, especially when in conjunction with a sine wave. And the second one is got more of a gritty quality because the warp is changing to a less logarithmic curve and just making the shape a little bit more complex, and therefore adding a lot more complex harmonics to this sine wave. Then in the effects, distortion, of course, compressor, which is just controlling the dynamics, and this filter, which is on a comb, and this is giving a lot of character. It gives it this nice tail, which is coming from the resonance. If I have less resonance, it's not as long, but if I have more resonance, it's got this nice tail. Also, the frequency is set to 38 Hertz, which is the frequency of D sharp, which is the key of this track. For the warp mode, this first one, I've got the warp set down here for the bubbles. If it was up here, we'd have the grit. And then I've got this one that starts high, but then sweeps down to a lower value because I didn't like how it sounded with a lot more of that gritty quality. I just wanted it for the initial. Moving on, we've got this LFO layer. and also a little percussive that follows. I probably should have mentioned that with the rest of the percussion. And once again, that is just another knock sound that I made using Serum 2. This LFO layer is made using a saw wave with a bunch of unison voices that is being phase distorted with another saw wave that's an octave higher, that is also itself being FM'd by this sine wave that is a further octave higher and 7 semitones up. What's happening here is that LFO1 is controlling the cutoff. The shape itself is getting less plucky towards the end of the sound. Also, the rate of that LFO is being affected by this shape here. And then this third LFO here is controlling the opening up of the cutoff, also the spread of the detune, which is making it more dissonant towards the end of the sound, and also changing the tone by removing a little bit of the phase distortion from this sine wave. And then we've got, of course, distortion, comb filtering, adding quite a nice character to the very beginning of the sound, but then the mix goes out over the course of the 2 bars. As the mix drops, the resonance goes up, and once again, this is tuned to the fundamental frequency to give us that nice resonant harmonic feel. I've got this high pass filter that starts it off on a higher frequency and drops it off. So it lets more of the sound in towards the end. And then this is just a little thing to add a little bit of fade in to the very beginning of the sound because I didn't want it to start too abruptly. Just a tiny fade in. And then LFO6 is controlling the smoothing of this first LFO. So like I showed on the shakers, it is basically creating a less abrupt shape on this curve here, and just softening it towards the end. So this last LFO here is creating a difference in the amount that this smoothing control goes. For this first one, it's a bit lower, doesn't smooth out as much, but then as you can see, this is a long LFO that is 8 bars long, and that means the second time it will happen, it'll be a little bit higher and therefore be a bit smoother towards the end, just for a smidge of variation. Finally, on this sound, we've got a macro that is attached onto this control here, which is the shape of the slowing down of the LFO rate. So then the second time this happens, this automation has moved up and made it so that the shape of the LFO rate change is different, just for a bit of variation, right? If we move into the mixer track now, so first of all, we just got the basics. We've got a little bit of saturation and this EQ cutting off the lows. Don't want any clash with the bass line as usual. Got this Valhalla room here just being automated in on the mix. So the first iteration has it so that the wet level of the reverb goes up throughout the sound. And then the second time it happens, it starts with a very high wet level, so it's pretty much like an atmosphere, and then it gets drier, which gives the impression that the sound is coming closer towards you. So that gives a nice feeling of alternation, so it's not the exact same sound every time. And then I've got these little detail layers that are these little glitches. And these come from a really long file just filled with lots of random generative glitchy things that I use Serum 2 for. And I'll definitely make a video on these kinds of glitches at some point. But all you need to know is that I've basically set up a bunch of random modulations in Serum and just attached it to the most abstract controls, basically trying to break the synth in multiple ways. Then you just bounce out a bunch of these random recordings of glitches that you've made. Then you can just scrub through and you just find cool parts within the sound and just use little bits of it to find little accents and details and stuff like that. And as you can hear, it's most certainly got some reverb on it. a little bit of delay as well, but that's tonal delay. So it's literally just adding a little bit of character to it. It's literally just a 0.1 second delay. And then I've just got this EQ that's just making it nice and bright, cutting any unwanted lows once again. Got a few more iterations of this. Different position. Then I've got 2 different parts of the same glitch. That is the glitches. And then we've got just this percussive thing here that's got some delay on it. And yeah, some little background atmospheres. So we've got a little swell that is just a reverb tail that's been reversed. We've also got this glassy atmosphere. I've also made a tutorial on how to make your own ones of these. Also, I've got this final riser at the very end that just helps build a little bit more extra tension at the very end of this loop. And then, yeah, finally, we've got the FM donk, which if you've been watching my channel, then you've definitely seen the how-to of this. And then that is the completed loop. I love making this style of music, and we'll definitely continue to do more tutorials on Psy-tech orientated stuff. And hopefully that's demystified a little bit the process of making music overall. With all that being said, you know how to support the channel, and I'll see you on the next video.